Story 4. Night Shift at the Asylum. It was a night like any other, at San Vicente Asylum, a place where time seemed to stand still. Corridors were long, dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and medicine. Claudia, the nurse in charge of the night shift, was accustomed to the quiet, somber environment of the asylum. But that night, something was different. As she walked down the corridors, a strange sound interrupted the silence. Laughter. Children's laughter, echoing from somewhere upstairs. She stopped, trying to pinpoint the origin, but the sound seemed to come from all directions. The only thing she knew was that there should be no children in the asylum, especially at that hour of the night. A shiver ran down her spine, but she decided to investigate, slowly climbing the stairs, which creaked under her feet. On the second floor, the laughter abruptly stopped, plunging the place into an even more unsettling silence. Claudia walked down the hallway, trying to ignore the growing feeling that she was being watched. When she reached the end of the corridor, she stopped in front of a door she had never noticed before. It was a locked room with an old, faded plaque that was unreadable. The key wasn't on her ring, which was strange since she was supposed to have access to all the rooms in the asylum. Something about that room felt wrong, as if an invisible shadow enveloped it. Claudia tried to force the door open. She couldn't. She decided to return to the office and search the room's history, hoping to discover what was behind that mysterious door. As she sifted through the old asylum records, Claudia found a document that made her blood run cold. The locked room was the former room of a child named Sophia, who had died decades ago. The girl had been admitted to the asylum for being deemed uncontrollable after her parents died in a fire. The staff at the time reported that Sophia was a troubled child with disturbing behaviors until one day she was found dead in her room without an apparent cause. Since then, the room had been locked and forgotten. The laughter, Claudia realized, was not of joy, but something much more sinister. Sophia, or what was left of her, was still there, waiting for someone to find her. Back in the second-floor corridor, Claudia felt a pressure in her chest as if an invisible hand were squeezing her heart. As she passed the doors of the other rooms, she noticed something was wrong. All the doors, which had been opened before, were now locked. She tried to force them open, but none budged. Panic began to set in, and she found herself staring at Sophia's door, now seeming more threatening than ever. The only way out of that corridor was through that door. But when she put her hand on the doorknob, she felt an intense cold creeping up her arm. Suddenly, the door opened on its own, revealing the dark room. Claudia knew she shouldn't enter. Something inside her, an irresistible force, pushed her in. Inside the room, the air was heavy as if time had stopped. The place was decorated like a child's room, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room was a small bed, with the sheets still neatly arranged as if Sophia were about to lie there. But what caught Claudia's attention was the diary on the desk beside the bed. Trembling, she opened it and began to read the last pages. What she found made her question her sanity. The words were those of a child. The content was dark and disturbing. Sophia wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows, and being visited by a dark figure that promised to take her to a better place. Claudia realized that Sophia hadn't died alone. Something had come to take her, and now it seemed to be back. As she read, Claudia felt a presence behind her. The air grew colder, and a shadow began to form in the room's mirror. The figure Sophia had described was there, just a few meters away. Claudia tried to run, but the doors slammed shut, trapping her inside. The shadow slowly approached, and she felt the despair grow with each passing second. Suddenly, the figure stopped, and in a swift motion, lunged at Claudia. The darkness engulfed her completely until Claudia was called by an elderly resident of the asylum. He simply said, "Claudia, there are things we shouldn't wake up." No one could explain what had happened. Claudia was in shock. It had all been so real. San Vicente Asylum gained a reputation for being haunted, with the laughter of a child echoing through the corridors whenever someone fell asleep during the night shift. Story 5. The Screams of the Psychiatric Hospital. The night shift at the old San Francisco Psychiatric Hospital was always silent, but that night, The silence was shattered by a terrifying scream that echoed through the corridors. Roberto, one of the nurses, was alone in the hospital's oldest wing when he heard the sound. It was a scream of pure despair, coming from one of the rooms he knew was empty. His heart raced, but he forced himself to go there, thinking it might be a lost patient or a cruel prank. When he reached the door of the room where the scream seemed to have come from, he found only darkness. But what he saw inside was even more disturbing. The bed was disheveled, as if someone had struggled there, and deep scratch marks covered the walls. Roberto felt a chill down his spine, but he tried to convince himself that everything had a logical explanation. After all, it was just another night of work. Or so he thought. After the scream, Roberto couldn't get what he had seen out of his head. He returned to the nurse's station, trying to calm himself and focus on his task. But as the night wore on, he began to notice something strange. The hospital walls, which had always been oppressively silent, began to whisper. Disjointed words like pain, fear, and help echoed through the empty corridors. At first, he thought he was hearing things, but when he passed through one of the older corridors, he noticed something terrifying. The words were being written on the walls, appearing as if carved by invisible hands. Desperate, he tried to erase the marks, but they only became clearer, deeper. Every step he took seemed to lead to another disturbing message, as if the hospital walls were alive, trying to tell a forgotten story. Roberto decided to investigate further what was happening. He began reviewing the hospital's old records, trying to find any clues about the strange events. That's when he discovered something that left him speechless. There were records of a patient everyone believed had died years ago, but whose name continued to appear in reports. This patient, known only as Patient 27, had been admitted after a series of violent and inexplicable incidents. No one knew for sure how he had died, but the records showed that even after his supposed death, staff continued to report encounters with him, describing him as a figure who would appear and disappear in the corridors. Roberto realized that the scream he had heard and the words on the walls were all connected to this patient. And now he was being dragged into the same nightmare. As the night wore on, Roberto began to lose track of time. Hours passed, but the inexplicable events continued, as if he were trapped in a cycle of terror. The lights began to flicker. Doors that should have been locked opened on their own, and shadows danced at the edges of his vision. He tried to flee the hospital, but every time he reached the exit, he found himself back in the same corridor where it all began. The air seemed heavier, filled with a malevolent presence he couldn't see but could feel. Roberto began to hear distorted laughter and footsteps that followed him, even though he knew he was alone. Reality seemed to warp around him, and he realized he was beginning to lose his sanity. Determined to end it once and for all, Roberto returned to the room where the scream had echoed at the beginning of the night. This time, he was armed with the determination to confront whatever was haunting the hospital. As he entered, the room seemed even darker and more oppressive. But he didn't hesitate. He began calling out for Patient 27, demanding answers. For a moment, everything went silent, as if the hospital itself were holding its breath. Then, a figure began to form in the darkness, a tall and indistinct shadow. Roberto felt terror take hold, but he stood his ground. The figure approached, revealing a disfigured, expressionless face, eyes that seemed like pits of despair. The ghostly patient spoke, but his words were incomprehensible, like a distant echo of pain and anger. Roberto realized the figure was trapped, doomed to relive his suffering eternally, and that he was now being dragged into this cycle of agony. That morning, when the other nurses arrived for their shift, they found Roberto in a deplorable state. He was sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth, muttering nonsense. His eyes were glazed over as if he had seen something his mind couldn't comprehend. The walls around him were covered in words written in what appeared to be dried blood, and the name Patient 27 was deeply engraved on every surface. Roberto was taken to a special ward. He never returned to normal. He recounted everything that had happened. No one believed him. San Francisco Hospital was finally closed, deemed a cursed place, and stories of screams and shadows are still told by those who dare to pass by at night. They say Patient 27 is still there, waiting for his next victim, while the screams of despair echo through the empty corridors, never finding rest. Story 6. The Last Delivery. Raphael had been working as a delivery driver for years, always navigating the city's streets until late at night. He had delivered everything from ordinary packages to the strangest and most unusual items. But that night, a different package caught his attention. When he arrived at the depot to pick up his last delivery of the night, the manager handed him a small box wrapped in brown paper, with no sender or indication of origin. Only an address was written in a shaky, almost illegible handwriting. There was something strange about that box, a sense of weight, as if it carried something much darker than its size suggested. Raphael felt a chill as he touched it, but it was just a job, and left to make the delivery. The address led him out of town, down a deserted, winding road that seemed never to end. As he drove, the radio signal faded away, leaving him only with the sound of the car's engine and the rustling of trees in the strong wind. The clock on the dashboard read nearly midnight when Raphael finally saw a house in the distance, perched on a hill. It was an old building with narrow windows and a slate roof that seemed forgotten by time. As he approached, he noticed that the house's lights were off, except for a single dim bulb on the porch. Feeling of discomfort grew with every meter, but he needed to finish his job. He parked the car, grabbed the box, and climbed the creaking steps of the porch, feeling as if something were watching him. When Raphael knocked on the door, the sound echoed through the empty house. There was no response. He knocked again, harder this time, and the door creaked open on its own with a sinister groan. Inside the house, the air was thick and humid, with the smell of old wood and something else, something he couldn't identify. The interior was decorated in an old-fashioned way, with dusty furniture and heavy curtains that blocked out any moonlight. In the center of the room was a small table, and beside it, a rocking chair that moved slowly, as if someone had just gotten up. Raphael called out, but no one answered. He hesitated, but decided to go in to leave the package. As he approached the table, he felt a chill on the back of his neck, as if something were getting closer. But when he looked back, there was nothing. He placed the package on the table and turned to leave as quickly as possible. As he neared the door to leave, Raphael saw a figure standing in the doorway, blocking his way. It was a woman, pale, with long, disheveled hair, wearing an old-fashioned dress that looked like it belonged to another era. Her eyes were dark, lifeless, and she watched him in silence. Raphael tried to speak. Words got stuck in his throat. The woman raised a hand, pointing at the box he had just placed on the table. He didn't know what to do, panic beginning to set in. The figure didn't move, just kept pointing, as if expecting something from him. Raphael felt he had to do something, anything, to get out of there. Grabbed the box again, but the woman disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared, as if she had never been there. Confused and terrified, he decided he needed to open the package. With trembling hands, Raphael tore off the brown paper wrapping the box. Inside, he found a small wooden urn, dark and varnished, with strange symbols carved into its surface. He opened it, revealing a disturbing content. Ashes. Next to the ashes was a small note, written in the same shaky handwriting as the address. "This is your destiny," read the message, with no further explanation. Raphael felt a chill, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. He looked around, feeling surrounded by an invisible presence, something he couldn't see but could feel. The box seemed to pulse in his hands as if it were alive, and suddenly he knew he needed to get rid of it. Desperate, Raphael ran out of the house, still holding the urn. He got into the car and sped down the deserted road as fast as he could, wanting only to put as much distance as possible between him and that house. But no matter how far he drove, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no signs of civilization. The radio began to hiss, and then a familiar voice started to whisper through the speaker, the same voice of the woman he had seen. She repeated the words from the note, "This is your destiny," over and over. Raphael tried to turn off the radio, but the voice continued, getting louder each time until it felt like it was screaming in his ears. Suddenly, the car stopped. He tried to start the engine again, but there was no response. The darkness of the night surrounded him, and the last thing he saw was the figure of the woman standing on the road. coming towards him. The next day, they found Raphael's car abandoned by the roadside, with the driver's door open and the empty urn on the passenger seat. They found Raphael a few minutes away from the car, completely terrified. He recounted the events, but no one believed him. Exhausted, he convinced himself that it had all been a figment of his imagination. He took a few days off work, and when he returned, the same box was waiting to be delivered. Incredulous, Raphael refused to make that delivery. Someone else was sent in his place, and the delivery was completed successfully. No one ever understood what had happened, and Raphael remains terrified to this day. If you enjoyed these stories and have the courage to explore the darker side of the human mind, don't miss our upcoming videos. Here, the terror is real, and each tale takes you deeper into a universe where fear is your only guide. Subscribe now and join us on this journey through the most disturbing narratives you've ever heard. Turn on notifications to be the first to discover the new stories that will chill you to the bone. Come, if you dare, and be part of this community of horror lovers.